All right, thank you, Paul. I want to follow up. I noticed there was a comment on phishing emails being the big problem, and I think that's right. One kind of interesting training method that we've had some experience with that I think is very effective is what we call white hat phishing, where we basically will bring in an outside contractor to fish our own company, and through that you'll find that if you do that periodically, you will find that there are sort of habitual repeat offenders on the phishing. Some people get it, some people refuse to get it or ignore it, and once the individual, can anybody hear me? Not sure what's going on. I'll keep going, but if an individual clicks on a phishing email, essentially
Alex, we've got you.
Great, sorry. So when people click on one of the white hat phishing emails, they'll get a visit from HR or from IT, whoever's sort of managing that process, to counsel them on what they did wrong, how to do it differently in the future. What we find in those types of exercises is the same people over and over and over again, and sometimes the embarrassment of being sort of singled out for those visits, or maybe just realizing that the company is paying attention makes a difference and can improve behavior. So with that said, let me move on to creating an incident response plan. And I think the theory is that regardless, despite our best efforts, if you can go back up one slide. Can you back up one? Thanks. So despite best efforts, there's no way to 100% prevent a data breach. It just happens. Sometimes it's a technological issue. Sometimes it's just human carelessness. There are essentially two ways, I guess, initially to think about creating your response plan. One is the proactive side, and the other is the reactive. What do you do before there is a breach, and what do you do after there's a breach? On the front side, and this has been touched on, so I won't dwell, but assessing your vulnerability, the threat that exists, the risk of that threat, and the impact. And all that means is, what are your weaknesses? What are the entities that can hurt you, whether it be carelessness, whether it be random searching by hackers, or targeted threats, depending on the type of business that you have? What is the likelihood that that threat matches up with your vulnerability, and what is the impact? What is the cost of that to you if that occurs? Creating a response plan, and we're going to talk about that in more detail. Training for that response plan. You can't just create a plan and put it on the shelf. And then regularly evaluating the response procedures, because this, if anything, I can make one point clear that data security is a very dynamic field. It's changing constantly. The technology is changing. The sophistication of the attackers is changing. So it's something that has to be revisited over and over. On the reactive side, once a breach occurs, if you're aware of it, the main thing is follow your plan. If you have a good plan in place, that is sort of reasonable behavior for the business or for your client, is for them to follow their plan. Just like any policy, employment policy, the worst thing you can do is have a policy that you don't actually follow, and the same would be true for a security plan. Once that breach has been dealt with, evaluating plan performance and then revising it if necessary. The touchstone of what makes what is sort of legally defensible security plan is whether or not it was reasonable under the circumstances. And if you've failed to evaluate and find the weaknesses in your system and change them, then when the next breach comes along, your old plan is likely to be deemed unreasonable because you didn't address a known failure. So we can go to the next slide. So what I created here was just sort of a response tree. Now, I will point out that when you are, I think sort of the key to keep in mind is sort of good people and good processes. You got to have good people to manage the response to a breach, and you need good processes in place. And what we have here is sort of what I would call sort of the generic ideal response, realizing that some entities don't have a separate IT department and a legal department and a business department. You may have multiple functions along this tree being filled by the same person, depending on the size of the company. But one thing I want to point out is that the incident response leader is really sort of the critical role here. It serves a critical role. It needs to be somebody who's independent of IT. You can't just default and say, okay, it's a data security problem, my IT department's going to handle it. Because unfortunately, there's always the risk that IT is going to go into sort of a CYA mode of if something went wrong on their end, are they going to try to cover it up or protect themselves? You want somebody that's independent of that group, also not just for that reason, but also because you need somebody who can keep a big picture view of the effect of the breach on the company. IT has a very focused view on what went wrong. Legal will have a very focused review on what do we have to do now, and the business people, what are the consequences, how is this going to hurt the bottom line? And you need somebody who can manage all of those perspectives, because that person also is likely going to be the one who is communicating with outsiders on the issue, whether it be the media or potentially regulatory or even the board of your company. So somebody who can keep a big picture. I would say that response leader, most importantly, is going to be a good communicator and have project management type skills to keep the process moving. So essentially what happens when in the first 24 hours when a breach is discovered, the incident response leader will be notified and will kick into action the plan. And ideally the plan will have multiple parties working on their own sort of bailiwick. IT's job is to investigate and secure the system, and that's really the first step. Because you've got to identify the compromised data, how it was taken, and then plug the hole so that no more data is lost. That information, is useful then for the other entities that have to follow along. The legal response side is to alert law enforcement if it looks like it was a criminal activity of some kind, to determine what the state notification laws are that apply, determine if there's regulatory compliance at issue, and then be preparing for litigation. Now, fortunately for legal, they can prepare a lot of this in advance. Certainly, in some instances at least, it's possible to know which states' laws will be implicated by a potential breach. There are roughly 47 states with data breach notification laws in the country right now. They all differ. They're very similar, but there's lots of little differences. But generally, they're triggered by it's not where the breach occurs that determines whose law applies. It's whose data has been affected. If it's an individual that lives in Alaska, then you have to comply with Alaskan notification law. So if the company does business in 1 or 2 states, then they maybe don't have to have a 50-state survey prepared, but it's a good idea for legal to get a head start on that. And then the business response, once they sort of know the legal side, the legal exposure, they also have to think about the business exposure. All of those things can be happening to some degree simultaneously, and the incident response leader is primarily responsible for making sure that the groups are communicating with each other and then communicating the results upward to leadership or to the media, whatever the case may be. So let's look at the next slide. And this just goes to show sort of how the integration works, because there really has to be an integrated response. IT is determining what was compromised, who was affected, and how it occurred. Legal is determining applicable laws, notification obligations, jumping on that because many of the states require notification in 30 days, 45 days. It varies from state to state, but that is a process that has to go forward. Legal can handle, or it can be outsourced. And then potential legal exposure, and then the business questions. I will say that on the investigative side, IT, if it can be done, it's a good idea to bring in a third-party outside forensic investigator to determine the nature of the breach, how it occurred. Again, just to avoid any sort of self-interest in the IT department to cover it up. You want to get to the bottom of it. It also is much more defensible to say that a third party came in and did the investigation. On the legal side, you can contract with companies that will handle the notification process. It can be quite onerous if you have hundreds of business records that are affected, or really thousands of people that are affected and require notification. It can be overwhelming, and there are entities that specialize in that, but a legal department can do it, or a law firm, to write the notifications, make sure that they're sent out in compliance with the applicable laws. The response leader coordinates the efforts, oversees communications. I have one voice there because it's important for a company that's been hit with a data breach to speak with one voice on the subject. Not that IT or legal or business individually can't be articulate on it, but again, it's a matter of keeping the big picture. IT may not be aware of all the business concerns. Business may not be aware of all the legal implications. response leader can fill that role. And see the next slide. The most common question I get related to data security from the in-house counsel that I work with most often is, okay, that's all great, but what do I have to do? What am I required to do? And right now, to be honest, there's no great checklist that we can give you to say these are the things you have to do. What I would say is before the occasion of a breach, you are required to develop and implement a reasonable security measures and practices. What reasonable means for the lawyers, I mean, it's obviously it's sort of an amorphous thing, but we know what you sort of know what it is. If you're in an industry that's heavily regulated, then generally there are going to be federal regulations that sort of dictate or are the standard of what is reasonable. You know, if you're dealing in the health industry, then you're going to need to be HIPAA compliant, or you know, energy also has issues, regulations that they have to follow as well. So, but what is reasonable is scalable. It depends on the size of the company. What's reasonable for IBM to do in data security is different than what's reasonable for the mom and pop on Main Street. So that is an area where there's no one size fits all, but I would say it's industry specific, and you should be educated on your industry, what's being done, and what would be considered reasonable. If a third party disinterested were to hear your plea of what you try to do, what would be reasonable under the circumstances? Complying with industry rules and regulations is a great way to kind of hit that reasonable mark. And preparing a response plan, I can tell you that it will be very hard to sell your preparation as being reasonable if you had no plan in place to respond. Good or bad, at least you've made the effort to create a response plan that shows that you considered the risk and tried to prepare for it. I would say that is an essential component of reasonable security measures. Post-breach, what do you have to do? You have to comply with the notification laws. Some of the laws will create private causes of action. Some states do not. They leave it to the state attorney general. And then some of the industries are governed by the regulatory agencies that can that sort of met out punishment for failure to comply. And then evaluating the breach and making improvements where needed, as we already sort of discussed, is going back and looking after the fact and trying to address the areas of concern, the holes that were discovered, the failures of your response plan, and fixing those for the next time, so that when it happens again, your response will be at least educated, and it will be more likely to be considered reasonable. So that's sort of the basics of creating a response plan. It really is specific case by case with the certain industry standards to go by, but it's something that requires some thought. It requires getting a team together, whether it be 2 people or 20, and having them sort of think ahead, what are we going to do, create a plan, practice that plan, train on it, and revise it. And that's it. I see we're kind of up against the clock, so I don't know if we're doing questions, but I'm happy to answer if we are.